So now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you John Davis, who is a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Linguistics at Georgetown University and the co-director of a language resource center at Georgetown called the Assessment and Evaluation Language Resource Center. He's got a PhD in Second Language Studies from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and he's been at Georgetown since 2013. John is a world traveler. He was born in Australia, grew up in California, went to the University of California at Santa Barbara, where he got a BA. Then he went back to Australia and got an MA in TESOL in Applied Linguistics, and then came back midway to Hawaii and got his PhD in Second Language Studies. He gave a presentation, a plenary presentation at the most recent Georgetown University Roundtable, and was introduced by John Norris, who was his advisor at Hawaii, and praised him for having completed the the quickest dissertation in their program. It took about a little less than a year to finish his dissertation, and it was all the more remarkable because at the same time he was teaching his advisor how to surf. So actually John talked more about surfing than about anything else, didn't he?
That's quite true.
He has his area of interest is in assessment and program evaluation. He has a number of articles that are coming out. Most recently, one that was published was on in the Modern Language Journal on Capacity Framework for Useful Student Learning Outcomes Assessment in College Language Programs. He's co-edited a volume on student learning outcomes assessment. He's going to be talking, I'm going to cut this short. He's going to be talking to us today about the usefulness of accreditation-mandated assessment in U.S. community college language programs. John Davis.
Right. So you'll just forgive me for the moment while I do this. Is that about right? Yeah. Thanks very much, Dan, for that very nice introduction. I did have the distinction of having the shortest PhD. That was because I had the longest and most failed proposal period. So having been chastened after that experience, I figured I'd better pick up the pace. So it's not as much of a distinction as you might think. But thank you, Dan, nevertheless. So this is my topic for today, the usefulness of accreditation-mandated assessment in U.S. community college language programs. As Dan says, I'm the director for a co-director, I should say, for the Assessment and Evaluation Language Resource Center. This is a project emanating out of my time there and a concern for the Assessment and Evaluation Language Resource Center. Ostensibly, the AELRC is tasked with supporting evaluation and assessment efforts in U.S. foreign language education, supporting teachers and students in those efforts. And I focused on community colleges. And this is it's a survey study looking to see whether or not, very roughly speaking, whether or not, let's say, how well community college educators are enabled to do assessment and evaluation, and also a rough needs analysis. What do community college educators need to undertake successful assessment and evaluation? So that's my task for the day. I wonder if any of you have seen this. The knowing reaction there. This was on the Chronicle of Higher Education. It was called First Year Faculty Meeting Bingo. And the idea here was that when something came up, when a topic like this came up in the meeting, I think you had to tweet. And Or no, I think once you got bingo, then you had to tweet bingo to whoever was involved in playing this game. And you can see some of the topics there. They're all a little bit tongue-in-cheek, right? Speaker laughs at his own joke, critical thinking. I would put it to you, things that weren't to be taken seriously, maybe. I think it's a fair interpretation. But I can tell you that the number one answer there was that one, assessment. Now, that might not be what your first instinct is, what that term means. In point of fact, it's something else. It's not quite proficiency testing or some of the sorts of ideas that might leap most quickly to mind when you hear the word assessment. In fact, it's this. I'm going to call it student learning outcomes assessment, and it's this process. 4 steps, right? They'll look familiar. Developing learning outcomes, assessing student performance, analyzing results, and the crucial last part there is using results to do something formative or something productive, take some change or et cetera in a program. In point of fact, I'm going to call that evaluation, and I'll argue why. I think it is a form of evaluation and not quite a form of assessment at all. And why assessment was the number one most frequent answer as well on the bingo game, the Twitter bingo game. These are the 7 accreditation commissions for higher education in the United States. And they are the main drivers of that framework that I showed you before, assessment. And you might be interested to know that key changes in accreditation have resulted in the mandate of assessment, such as I described it before. Now that's what it looks like. But what accreditation commissions now want from universities is this process implemented across the board. Every single program and co-curricular program at a university in higher education in the United States, if you want to be accredited, you need to show your accreditor evidence that you're engaging in this process. And particularly that you're developing learning outcomes, you're collecting information on the degree to which students have attained those outcomes. You should analyze results, but the crucial part of this is using results to do something practical, useful with respect to instruction. You're using evidence of student performance to take curricular actions, make improvements, do something, improve, or better understand. So I think I've gone through a couple of these points, right? To become accredited in U.S. institutions, you must now show evidence that you are fulfilling your institutional mission, you're achieving core purposes. The institution must show they're attending to educational effectiveness now. And the new change in accreditation over the last, 25 years or so, is that the way you demonstrate that a university is attending to educational effectiveness is by showing proof or evidence of assessing student learning at institutional levels, but also throughout every program, co-curricular or otherwise, at the university. And of course, this has implications for language education. Language programs are various majors and other language programs. And it has 2 main purposes, right? Educational improvement, ostensibly on the one hand, but it's also an accountability in name, an accountability system as well. The reason we've had these changes in accreditation is by indirect pressure applied by the federal government to accreditation commissions who have sort of been deputized to play an accountability role because of concerns with economic competitiveness and all of these sorts of discourses that circulate from time to time about the quality of education at all levels, but in this particular case, higher education. So accreditation commissions are saddled with this. I shouldn't say saddled, have adopted this because of pressure from the federal government. So there's an accountability use here. But the extent to which accreditation achieves these aims is very much in question. This is a quote. I'll read you a quick quote from 2 commentators on this variety of evaluation in higher education, well-known commentators, Kerr and Eikenberry. They say the following. While considerable assessment activity is underway on college and university campuses, American higher education is far from where it needs to be in assessing student learning and in using the results to improve outcomes. Our findings suggest that the productive use of learning outcomes assessment information by campuses and programs to inform decisions and to improve teaching and learning remains the most important unattended challenge in this effort. Maybe you've heard this notion of a failure to close the loop. Maybe this is familiar language to you. There's all sorts of implementation of the requirements to do assessment, maybe an assessment office. But educators meaningfully using assessment towards educational change is rather the unrealized part of this whole affair. In language, right, so again, this has implications, this impacts language education at the university level. John Norris has this to say about the impact of accreditation-driven assessment in language education, university language education. The unfortunate reality, by and large, is that the idealized role for assessment as an agent of supportive program enlightenment and change is far from reality in college foreign language education and elsewhere. And I'll just read you a little corroborating quote here from one of my survey respondents in a study that I did. I wonder if this doesn't quite capture some of the views in the audience as well. But anyhow, most view assessment as a chore that is faddish at best, and that it will eventually die with the academic community as a formal process. So, the usefulness of this system is rather in question, both in language education and throughout higher education. Now, if this was an alarming observation currently, it's a well-known fact in the history of evaluation research. In fact, assessment is a very old type of educational evaluation. It's called objectives-based educational evaluation. It was invented by a guy called Ralph Tyler many, many years ago. In fact, in the 1950s, he had a system of educational evaluation which was precisely this: articulating outcomes, collecting information on outcomes, and coming to some determination about the quality of instruction on the basis of student performance and taking actions as a result if there was some kind of shortfall. This was used in the 1940s and 50s, and in fact, it was a system that was integrated into some rather large-scale, high-profile government evaluations, educational evaluations of some great society programs. So this is from the Lyndon Johnson administration. So this was lots of government money used to see how well federal funding had been spent in these federal education programs that were supposed to help socially, economically depressed sorts of areas, schools in these areas. And these evaluations, which borrowed this objectives-based evaluation approach, were conspicuous failures. So this was, the fact that objectives-based evaluation was not useful was well known in the 1960s, even though we're coming to this realization in higher education some, whatever it is, 50 years later. And so given that, the history of program evaluation research, and I'll just very quickly characterize it here, not taking much time with this, has been a response to this conspicuous failure of objectives-based education evaluation. And so I'll just throw up, now the details of this are not very important. There's a bunch of approaches and types of evaluation throughout the years that have been developed to try and deal with this problematic aspect of objectives-based evaluation, of evaluation in general, trying to make the whole process of evaluation more useful, right? And all of these developments, right, use-focused approaches, empowerment evaluation, program logic, theory modeling, evaluation capacity and capacity building, that's the one I'll focus on. All of these, to some extent, have been a reaction to these failed evaluations many, many years ago. And so the program evaluation field has tried to deal with this problem. How do we make evaluation useful? It seems to be sort of a fundamentally non-useful enterprise. What can be done to kind of improve its usefulness? And all of these things have been designed for that purpose. So how do we make evaluation useful, right? So before I start talking about some of the approaches to making evaluation useful, let me just be clear that evaluation research separates evaluation into two types of uses. Good uses, that's a technical term, but how can, we want to know what makes evaluation useful. What do you mean by use, right? So there are such things as conceptual use, increases in understanding, instrumental use, which is the one that might leap to mind, fundamentally doing something on the basis of evaluation findings, and then learning from evaluation processes. Bad uses are you doing evaluation simply to show people that I'm doing evaluation, symbolic, and other ones, the details are not so important. But the idea here is that evaluation wants to know what are the approaches to evaluation, innovations, etc., that help us realize this and avoid this, right? You get the idea. Let me put a few very broad findings to you as quickly as I can. What has the evaluation field found out? Well, first, the usefulness of evaluation findings depends on aspects of the program context and aspects of implementation, right? So what are the conditions where evaluation is done? What impact does that have? And the way that evaluation does that, as you may well guess, that has an impact on how useful the evaluation process is. Evaluation usefulness is increased when there is stakeholder participation. This might be an idea we take for granted now, but it wasn't always known, that you should bring in stakeholders into the evaluative enterprise. Stakeholders learn a great deal from being involved in evaluation processes, which helps to enhance evaluation usefulness. And out of that, the final one, which is most interesting to me, certain organizational conditions and factors help that learning to happen. So let me just go back to 4 and say, an important realization in evaluation research is that your first instinct might be that evaluation findings, those are the things that you're going to look at and use, and those are the things that are going to have an impact on the on the program, take the recommendations, etc. But actually, it's being involved in evaluation, learning from the evaluation process. That, as it turns out, has as much salutary and ameliorative impact on a program as much as the findings. So it became very important to not only do an evaluation, have good findings, but have people involved as well. Having people involved and benefiting from being involved in the process seems to work better when there are certain contextual factors in place, is the claim from program evaluation research, and this is this notion of capacity. Evaluation usefulness is enhanced when there is sufficient evaluation capacity. I'll use this idea from program evaluation and try and apply it to language education. Capacity is the extent to which an organization has the necessary resources and motivation to conduct, analyze, and use evaluations. And what program evaluators have done, or program evaluation researchers, is that they've designed these capacity frameworks. A little bit positivist, but anyhow, they have their uses. And here's one that I'm borrowing from Cousins that was sort of quite influential for me. He calls it a capacity to do and use evaluation. So the claim being, the details of this aren't so important, but the claim here is that if an organization has robust capacity for organizational learning, if they have particular organizational support structures, if evaluation activity proceeds in a particular way, if evaluation capacity building activities are undertaken, if there's use of the evaluation process, if there's use of the evaluation findings, there's various benefits from simply happening. If certain conditions mediating evaluation use are in place, conducive collaboration within an organization, teamwork, etc., conducive communication, if leadership behaves in this particular way, and if there's stakeholder participation, if some of these elements are in place, then the claim is that if you go and do evaluation there, evaluation findings will have more of an impact, but also people will benefit from being involved in the evaluation process. This is the claim. So I took this idea and said, well, look, could we not think of a way, is this a relevant idea for language education, given that assessment is in fact a form of evaluation, objectives-based evaluation, it's had this same dubious, non-useful history up until now. Couldn't we use some of these ideas from program evaluation in a similar way that the history of program evaluation research has done and come up with some type of assessment capacity framework for foreign language programs? And so I did that. Tried to develop something similar. Literature reviews of best practices, foreign language assessment, focus groups with experts in foreign language assessment and evaluation, interviews with very, very competent and experienced academics who had programs with a very, very successful track record of assessment, Georgetown University German department being a primary among them, and came up with a few of these little categories and having a similar claim that if you have institutional support, if a program like a BA, if you like, a major program has sufficient institutional support, if they have conducive institutional governance and leadership, if there's a particular ethos in the program, if there are especially pro-SLO assessment attitudes, if there are a basic sort of minimum infrastructure for assessment, if there's sufficient program level support, this is a grab bag of high quality activities and conditions that I got from various highly competent programs. And if leadership behaves in a particular way, then my claim was that if you had all of these things in place, this would increase the usefulness, the likelihood of the usefulness of assessment in a foreign language program at the university level. It's a little bit positivist, I'll take that on the chin, but still helpful, I think. So, I used this as a kind of diagnostic tool. I thought, could we not use this as a kind of set of glasses, and if you sort of looked at a bunch of programs, could we not get some sense of how able university language programs are to engage in useful assessment? And so this is sort of a research agenda, shall we say, for the AELRC. We want to better understand how student learning outcomes assessment can be useful in college world language programs, using concepts from evaluation, in this particular instance capacity, to conceptualize useful SLO assessment conditions and practices. This is what I wanted to do, and this is what I'll talk about now. Use that framework as a way to sort of estimate amount of capacity in world language college programs and identify capacity shortfalls and other student learning outcomes assessment needs. And this is relevant for the AELRC because we have a mandate on the basis of this type of research to start to develop support, workshops, etc., that help people with assessment. And this is a way of getting a sense, well, what do they need? What do they have? What are they able to do? And where might we help? Now, I've done that in the past at the 4-year level, graduate level, but this project was focused on community colleges, right? Very important in my view. A federal education priority and an LRC priority, along with minority serving institutions for the last grant cycle. But let me put a few facts to you to try and convey that point. Community colleges enroll 46% of US undergraduate students. That's a lot, right? I would say it's American Association of Community Colleges there. 29% of post-secondary language students enrolled at are enrolled at two-year institutions. That's a third. That's a lot. That's a lot. That's from the latest MLA report enrollments in 2013. 50% of heritage language learners are at community colleges. That's from Fector 2010. We'll just trust her on that. I'm sure it's true. But 50% of heritage language learners, very little, virtually no, I would say, research on language assessment or evaluation in community colleges. I would hazard to say, just in my looking around, there's rather not much research on language education, assessment, teaching, etc. in community colleges in general. I think it's a real lacuna. I think it's really not being looked at. One study that I know of on assessment, and that had largely to do with enrollments. So I think this is a real concern. I think I'll flip all the cards. I'm a product of a community college, and so this is rather near and dear to my heart, right? These community colleges educate our minority students, working adults, immigrants, all sorts of very, very deserving sorts of people in these programs. So, I wanted to get a sense of, well, how able are these folks to do assessment? And I asked the following questions to investigate that concern. What are the patterns of student learning outcomes assessment in community college world language programs? I wanted to know how useful is this whole enterprise, just to get a sense of that. What are the patterns of assessment capacity in community college world language programs? How able are they to do this, to undertake this process which has been mandated on them by accreditation? How able are they to respond and use this system in a way that it's intended for helping language learning and teaching? And this one, what appear to be the student learning outcomes and capacity needs of language educators in community college world language programs. A needs assessment, a needs analysis really, and then the idea being to develop outreach and support, et cetera, to help redress whatever needs that might exist. So it was a questionnaire study, national questionnaire. It was an online questionnaire. I sent this to 535 programs. These were the only ones we could find online, frankly, where there was a contact for a language educator in a community college. That's out of 1,123 total two-year institutions. 93 programs responded, so 17.4 response rate, fairly low in the domain of non-response error, if any of you are take that sort of interested in that sort of thing. So cautious claims about generalization, certainly. Respondents were program heads and chairs, faculty, sometimes adjuncts, coordinators, language instructors and lecturers, whoever we could find that would be likely to be able to report on the assessment activity happening in their program. And so we started with the most senior person, and if there was a one-person Spanish department, which is commonly the case in community college language programs, we asked that person. And they're reporting on three main things: the types and frequency of their assessment uses. How productive is this whole process? Types of assessment capacity in those categories that I described, and what educators need in order to conduct assessment successfully. So these were the respondent types. Now this is all on your handout. I don't expect you to read all this stuff, but I'll go through a lot of information fairly briefly up here. If you want more detail, you can refer to this, but this is far more than I would expect you actually to read. Most of this, the respondent titles, number one, is all coming up here. So the people who responded are who you'd expect: professors, chairs, in those percentages, and then proportionally less of that group. So mainly, keep in mind the results that you're seeing reflect the views of those people. The languages are what you would expect, right? Spanish, French, German, the highest proportion, and then a lot less, some of the less commonly taught language. Tongan, I was delighted with this, that I got that one. That's really, really rather nice. So I'll just give you a sense of the enrollments of the programs that were responding. Probably the best indicator of central tendency, here's the median. That's going to skew that mean. So around 120 enrollments in each program. Length of time doing this was about 5 years. And so I asked these sorts of questions on the survey, right, to answer this question. And this was the sort of item that you would get. Now this asked about assessment use. To what extent has your program used assessment to do the following things: develop or modify instruction of courses with that rating scale? And I asked a whole bunch of other things as well. Now ideally, that's what assessment should be used to do. Rather less ideally is that, but important also. But I asked a bunch of questions in this vein. Did they use it to create additionally institutional assessment reports, justify or defend the program, better understand curricula, better understand teaching, and so on, and so on? You can see the list on your handout there on the bottom left. So what I'm going to do, I'll show you the results for use, and I'll show you for the results for capacity categories as well. And what I'll do is I'll put up a thing like this, and I'll just talk about the two most highly rated and the two most lowly rated items, just to sort of give you a sense of this and to kind of get through a lot of dense data quickly. But as you look through this, I'll just put these up ideas, this data up quickly. You can just compare the yellow and the white. You don't need to look at anything else really. Just compare the yellow and the white. The yellow is yes, we have a lot of this, we have a lot of capacity, right? Yes, we have it. This is the rating scale here, if you like. White means they don't have it. It's missing, either use or primarily capacity. So to what extent is your program using assessment findings to do the following? Well, meet institutional requirements. That's not what we really have in mind for this type of system, but also to develop or modify instruction. So that's looking rather promising. That seems to be rather a productive implementation of the system, at least in these universities. This is sort of neither here nor there, but people are using assessment less for creating new programs, less for comparing to other programs. These are slightly lower frequency types of assessment uses. But on the whole, the claim might be, well, there seems to be pretty good assessment use. Now, I also wanted to know how much assessment capacity was there. What do people have? What are they able to do? How likely is assessment going to be useful in these programs? And so I asked similar types of items here, right? So this is an example item from institutional support. So I said things like, does your university or college provide training workshops for student learning outcomes assessment? No. Developing? Yes. Don't know. That's sort of a shorter sort of 3-point scale. Or there's 2 different types of item, that type of scale and this type of scale. Leadership, right? To what extent do program leaders, by program I meant major, take the lead in initiating or coordinating outcomes assessment? So to those 2 types of items. So again, remember, yellow, yeah, we've got a lot of it. White, no, we don't have much. And for you, I apologize, some of these are slightly out of order, but if you flip through, you'll find all of the items, if you're interested in what I asked about, you'll find them all on the handout. So I asked them, institutional governance capacity, right? This is, how much does your program kind of oversee assessment with rules, regulations, how does leadership behave at the institutional level? All right, so I said, does your institute have leaders that encourage participation, right? Do they make it a part of student learning outcomes assessment duties? And yes, right, lots of requirements. Do they provide sufficient time? Not so much, a bit more white. And do you have leaders that follow up on assessment? Not quite so much. So that's all the analysis I give this, frankly. How much, right? Is there a lot of things, or is there a little of things? And where there starts to be a little of a capacity, AELRC sort of takes notice and says, okay, well, can we help? So, infrastructures. These are the sort of basic building blocks of assessment, right? Do you have student learning outcomes? Do you have rubrics? Most people have yes. Do you have an assessment committee? More white. And do you require outcomes assessment skills for hires? Rather less. So again, the claim here is that all of this stuff, all of the things that I'm asking about are needed and relevant for useful assessment to ensue. So when you start to get white, you start to reduce the likelihood that assessment is going to be useful. Educational objectives-based evaluation, really. The likelihood it's going to be useful starts to reduce. Right? Institutional support, I think this is a telling one. So, do you get tech support? Yeah. Training workshops, some do, some don't, right? Rewards or incentives for assessment? Nope, not at all. Well, not at all, but not much. And recognition for assessment? None. Helpful if you have this stuff, if you want assessment to really do what it's tasked to do. They don't have it. Similarly, program level support. If you have a Department of German, you have some funding there to do things that you want if needed, and you can allocate some of that to assessment. Typically, these guys have none of that. Well, very little. Do you provide technology? Do you have an assessment expert? Some, a third, but not much. Now we're really dropping off here. Can the department or unit provide funding? Not really. Does the unit go out of its way to obtain funding? No. Attitudes now. By ethos, I sort of meant the claim was that assessment would ensue productively if there was a general feeling of interest in educational innovation, if people sort of collaborated productively with one another. Right? So I asked these sorts of questions. To what extent the majority of your colleagues value innovation or development? Yes, everybody. To what extent do they desire program success? Everybody. Right? Willing to collaborate? Yes. Teach to the educational mission? Yes. So strong capacity there. Dedicated language educators, right? Now this is a kind of grab bag of high quality activities and abilities. And they had quite a lot of this as well, I have to be said. Is student learning outcomes assessment done for requirements? And that's a kind of a reverse-coded item. It would have been better here if this one was down below and you weren't doing assessment just because you were required to do so. So that's not a good sign, the gold there. This is a little bit of an exception. Is assessment ongoing or cyclical? Yes. Do faculty seek out extra student learning outcomes assessment information and research? Not so much. Is assessment communicated to outside audiences? Not so much. All right. And on the topic of particularly conducive attitudes towards SLO assessment specifically, not enough time to talk about it, but I did a factor analysis on all of this, and this turned out to be in fact a component analysis, and this was a component of these various constructs that came out. Do people think assessment improves learning? A majority of people seem half. Do they see a need for assessment? Yes, some. Do they proactively do outcomes assessment? Less. Do they think it's scholarly work? Not so much. Again, the more white you see, the less capability there is, at least in those programs, to be able to do assessment. And then the last one, the crucial one, in my view, leadership capacity. Couldn't be more important. To what extent do leaders in your department encourage outcomes assessment participation? Quite good. Participate actively, so kind of split. Some do, some don't. Publicly recognize or respect faculty, not so much, but some people certainly are. And to what extent do they address threats or barriers to assessment? You can see the other items that I asked about leadership. Leadership is probably one of the most important capacity categories for getting assessment done productively. Helpful leadership makes it happen. Unhelpful or indifferent leadership is just a knife in the heart of any useful evaluation practice happening in a program. And they might be justifiably resistant, but however you feel about it, leadership is helpful in making that happen. So I'm just going to throw up here then, going to research question 3, what are the SLO assessment capacity needs of language educators and community college language programs? These are sort of collecting all of the ratings in a particular capacity category. This is all of the yes ratings for all of the items. That's 58% for institutional government. So it's a total summing of all the yes ratings and all the developing ratings and all the no ratings in each of these capacity constructs. I'll just put up those. I'll put up the other scale here, right? And for us, really, the only the interesting picture that comes out here is that, to some extent, it's a little bit hard for the AELRC to address these sorts of things. Not impossible, but what stands out to us is the lack of institutional support and the lack of program support. So clearly, this seemed to potentially be an area where AELRC could start to supply training, workshops, etc. But let me also put to you a few little comments that people put in the questionnaire, each one of those capacity constructs. I also said, is there anything else that leadership could do to help assessment? Is there any other program resource that would help you do assessment? And people could comment. And this is where I think we get some unique capacity assessment issues having to do with community college language programs, right? So this is a comments analysis. It was kind of a content analysis using ideas from Huberman and Miles. I won't go into the details. So there were 71 respondents providing comments, 317 total comments, and additional statistics there as well. 10 open-ended questions. And what did we find? So this is a frequency analysis, really. I mean, what were the most commonly noted themes? What you would probably expect, they said we need more training, professional development, we need more time, we need more greater assessment experts. But they had this, we had I've called it, slightly uncharitably, issues with adjunct instructors. as you may well know, community colleges very, very much rely on adjuncts as part of the workforce. I would say more so, it's a trend in higher education as well. But they really have adjuncts doing a lot of the language instruction. And what did they say? What did respondents say? Well, what we need is better training for adjuncts, compensating them for their time to be trained to see the importance of this task. Most instructors are adjuncts, so buy-in is based on requiring them to participate. Since part-time instructors are not as vested in the college, their willingness to take on assessment activities are not automatically embraced. So I think this starts to be a little bit unique to community colleges. What additionally makes it hard for assessment to proceed successfully? The fact that potentially there's more adjunct instruction supplied by adjuncts in community colleges compared to higher education, arguably. Additionally, seeing what others are doing. We need more examples. This is what they say. We tend to be isolated. Hearing what other colleagues are doing and results they're getting would be very helpful in the community college system. There's often a sense and a tendency of reinventing the wheel. Communication among institutions of higher education could provide new ideas, information to provide data analysis and create solutions and ideas. This was a recurrent theme. It relates to the next theme that's coming up on the next slide, that there is a lack of collaboration, conspicuously, arguably more so maybe, in community colleges. And this is crucial to useful assessment. There needs to be productive collaboration between academics and across units as well. People learn from each other about how to do assessment and evaluation productively. Community colleges seem to be uniquely handicapped in this regard. I would put it to you. Why? For this reason. Now, a few other categories is here. We need to see have more sharing of data. We need more collaboration. We need more funding. We don't have the administration valuing assessment rather than just sort of doing it for perfunctory reasons, because of accreditation. But also this business of the single instructor, small department phenomenon. Might not, but I think it's true. Single instructor, small program. As a world language department, we are not actively involved with group assessment. Each instructor works on his or her own. I am the only foreign language instructor at my school. It would be nice to be able to collaborate with other teachers at meetings. It is difficult to do these as I am a department of one, and I only have 2 adjunct faculty members, both of whom have a full-time job outside of teaching part-time at my school. So I think this is a unique community college concern, that you have these single person department sorts of arrangements. Makes it very difficult to do assessment when you can't collaborate with any and you're not hearing about it from anywhere else. It makes it very difficult indeed. So, last slide. What are the findings that I saw? To sum up, patterns of capacity in addition to their assessment needs. So there's some, but rather uneven institutional support, right? Quite debilitating for useful assessment. Very little support at the program level. Plenty of governance and oversight. It's not all that helpful, but it can be. Dedicated faculty, adjuncts perhaps less so to assessment. Ambivalent attitudes towards assessment, particularly from adjuncts, but still quite a bit of high quality practice. So people sort of trying to do it, but with a number of these handicaps. What are their needs? I think this is a fair interpretation. Professional development, training, student learning outcomes assessment, knowledge and skills. They need this, and certainly the AELRC stands to supply that and has done this survey, this research to discover precisely this sort of thing and do this sort of thing. They need more outside help and expertise. Again, AELRC has a role to play here. Perhaps strategies for adjunct buy-in and participation, more collaboration and dialogue with peer institutions and colleagues, reducing the isolation of single instructors and small departments, and useful methods. This didn't come up in my presentation here, but what they wanted were accurate, trustworthy, effective assessment tools to be able to do assessment productively. So the AELRC endeavors to try and address this situation in community college language programs, a key concern for U.S. language instruction in general. And I'll leave it there. The end. Thanks very much. Yes, madam.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was wondering if you could go to the previous slide. I think one of the things that maybe, a little bit about our context here at Minnesota, we do actually have a majority of teachers in the 1,000 level languages are adjuncts, full-time adjuncts.
Yeah, right.
They're longer, but nonetheless have a year-to-year contract, and I think there's a lot of connections between the adjunct situations at community colleges. And I was interested to see your bullet point there, strategies for adjunct buy-in and participation. And I was wondering, what would be your vision for that?
For getting buy-in, and I don't think it's just adjuncts, and for this type of thing. That's the question I get every time I give this presentation. It's difficult. It's difficult, and there are many strategies. I think my answer to this is a slightly unsatisfactory one, but it's the one that I give. It needs to be regarded as something more than a perfunctory add-on that we do because accreditation tells us to do it. Now, that's a very difficult perception to try and change, but I think that's really the answer. When this is sort of regarded as a kind of accreditation and accountability mandate, you're up against it, frankly, with faculty buy-in. And I get sort of criticism, not criticisms, but I get things, I've had questions like, I don't want to do assessment because I don't subscribe to a behaviorist theory of learning from academics, and that shoe fits. That's the history of where objectives-based evaluation has come from. It's a failed sort of a system in many ways, but I think it can work. But it can't be this business of we have to do it. There needs to be a kind of message from someone. Now, it could be someone like a CARLA director or someone in a position of authority where assessment is part of a thoughtful and scholarly approach to improving language learning and teaching. So there are a number of tools at our disposal to do this. And where I've seen outcomes assessment leveraged successfully in universities is where the outcomes assessment office, and this is often something that's mandated by accreditation, the mistake I think campuses make is it's a separate entity that they call it the assessment office, and suddenly that group is now responsible for helping you meet your new accreditation requirements. What the cleverer, more strategic way of doing it is sort of winding that capability and that support capacity into some type of like Center for Teaching Excellence type entity, right? So this is the group that helps faculty teach, techniques for improving undergraduate, delivery of undergraduate education, and also we have some assessment support here as well. We've got a few people who know how to do surveys, write outcomes, give you some quick and dirty tips for how to get good assessment data, just to be able to know, so it's part of just a different approach, and it's nice when the person who's providing that assessment maybe has a bit of a scholarly history in that, does research in that, sort of takes it seriously, gives talks about the history of assessment and how and so it's regarded as a scholarly activity, right? And it can be productive, and in a scholarly way, it can be quite interesting for me. It has this nice history. And so there's just a different approach. It's pitched in a completely different way. Now, I might put it to you that is a good way to generate buy-in. Whether or not it's going to work with adjuncts, I don't know. But you're asking people to do something they fundamentally don't want to do, and where the jury's rather out as to whether or not it even helps. I think it can, but it needs to just be part of a general strategy of, look, there's all sorts of ways, I'm being slightly repetitive now, there's all sorts of ways of improving our educational practices, all sorts of ways of peering in and knowing epistemologically about what we're doing. Assessment is one. Assessment is one if it's done in a particular way. Yeah. Yes?
So I'm looking at your chart, number 11.
Yeah.
And which talks about programming efforts conducive to innovation and development.
Yeah.
And I'm really curious how the individuals you surveyed are thinking about innovation, what that innovation means for them, or what it means for us, and what program success means. Because at the university, as is the case elsewhere, many times success means equates with enrollment, and enrollment stability or enrollment increases.
Yeah.
And innovation could mean anything. It could mean suddenly we make all of our courses hybrid or fully online, or it could mean that we redevelop courses or that we develop entirely new courses, but it matters a lot what those innovations are.
It certainly does. I would happily take it on the chin that there's a flaw in the survey item in that direction. I think I would simply say that I am interested in whether or not there's a predisposition. And I think in this item I said, I don't know if I put it there, do a majority of people in your program have this attitude? Is there generally a predisposition towards valuing any one of those innovations? Do people generally want to do this type of thing? Do they aspire to any type of innovation? And I guess I didn't really care which one. Potentially a flaw in the item. I think I was more interested in, do you think this way? You know, this is trying to kind of it's very rough. I'm trying to get at some, kind of cultural culture. Right? A culture of evidence, a culture of inquiry, an inquiring mindset. This is a quote from Heidi Burns. I'm trying to capture this type of thing very in a ham-fisted way with these sorts of items. And so I'm interested, well, do you value innovation? However you define it. But that could be a flawed item. I'd happily concede that. Yeah. Maybe not happily, but I'd concede it. I'd concede it. I'd concede it. Yes?
Results, you pointed out a few things that were specific to the community college context, right? Like the concept of the fact that there are maybe potentially a higher proportion of adjuncts and that they might have smaller departments or one-person departments. Do you have a sense of what's happening at four-year institutions and whether these would be representative of that as well?
Yeah, this is a replication of precisely the same study in four-year institutions, yeah. So none of those sorts of comments at all. Yeah, there's buy-in issues, but nobody's saying, oh, we need to motivate the adjunct faculty. Those comments didn't come up in the four-year study, that we have this, there's a different recalcitrant problematic group. Shall I just leave it slightly vague for the moment? But it wasn't adjuncts. It wasn't adjuncts. It's something else. Yeah, right. Oh, yeah. Tell you what I really think over a beer later. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So since this was a replication study, did you observe any differences in regards to the respondents that you got from the four-year institutions as opposed to the community colleges? Would that might be a factor explaining the type of comments?
Two answers. The respondents, sort of the profile of the respondents was fairly similar, I would say. However, I do take your point that the type of person answering the questionnaire could be skewing results, and there could be some bias there, absolutely. I think, I've got non-response error here. And I had I had a low response rate in the four-year university program one as well. In the four-year university one, for example, I didn't ask, this is speculative, but I didn't ask, and maybe I should have asked, and it was been put to me in a similar question to yours, maybe I should have asked, what is your disciplinary speciality? Are you an applied linguistics, second language acquisition type, or are you literature, philosophy, cultural studies, film, etc., etc.? Now, I don't know who I had, but I could well imagine that results might fall one way or the other, depending on where you fall on that divide. I hope that's not uncharitable to someone in the audience. Actually, I am quite sympathetic to some resistant attitudes towards assessment. But this is simply to say that your point is well taken. In community colleges, I don't know what my speculation is there about what type of bias might have been introduced because of the respondent. It could be a simple one. The people who care about assessment responded, and the people who really hated it responded as well. So I don't know. You got 17% response rate. Can I generalize the population? No. Is this information that is useful for the AELRC to take practical actions, practical supportive actions to help language teachers? It's the best I've got, and it's the best I can do. And so I proceed on that basis. Have to. This is better than nothing. Better than nothing. Yeah. Yes, madam.
So in this study or in the 4-year, when you report to your stakeholders, with your findings, how have they responded? What kinds of things have they asked of you?
That's a very good question. It's the buy-in. Oh, the lady said, yeah, the buy-in question. This is all well and good, John. I mean, you've set the bar so high, it's the gold standard. I mean, how can we realize all of these benchmarks? And I sort of flip my hands and say, look, I don't apologize for setting the bar as high as I possibly could. This is what I was told by the research and by language educators who do this sort of thing. This is what they say should be in programs. And so I believe them, and I know it's a high standard. I think it's an empirical question now to go out and say, well, what does capacity building, now this is an idea from program evaluation as well. Given the importance of capacity and putting all of these components in place in a program, we need to do capacity building. And often evaluators will do capacity building before they undertake evaluation. They'll go in and diagnose the likelihood of evaluation succeeding in a program and go, oh, well, before we do evaluation, we need to do some capacity building here. And we know what capacity building is because we've been researching this for a long time. So let's do this. Let's have this workshop. Let's try and improve attitudes here, there, and the other thing. They know how to do it. Is there such, maybe there's an equivalent, an analogous capacity building type exercise that one could undertake for language programs? I'm not going to speculate about what that might be. I think it's an empirical question, and we could sort of pursue it one way or the other. I can give you my quick and dirty advice on how I think how to make evaluation useful and improve people's attitudes anyway for buy-in. I've got one idea, but I think it's an empirical question. How do we start to put these things in place? What are the roles for people? What's a disciplinary organization's roles in making all of this happen? ACTFL, right? Could they not take a more proactive role in circulating support and discourse on this topic, right? And there's disciplinary and all sorts of different levels where we could start to build capacity to make this a more productive exercise in language education programs. Yeah, Mike.
It seems to me a little bit of the fuzziness of this, and maybe the difference between what you might get at a 4-year institution and a 2-year institution is what those student learning outcomes expectations are.
Yeah.
What's our program about?
Yeah.
It seems to me that there would be probably kind of a major difference between what you're expecting in a 2-year institution and what you'd be expecting in a 4-year institution. Is there anything did you take account of that in this project, or?
No, I think the project is a little bit agnostic as far as that goes. The project I think is trying to find out, however you set your benchmarks, ACTFL proficiency guidelines, I don't know, wherever you get them from, a little bit agnostic to that. What the program is interested in, well, given however you've set benchmarks for yourself, how likely are you able to use those benchmarks and evidence on the degree to which students reach those benchmarks? How likely are you to be able to use that whole system for some productive programmatic action in your in the program? So I guess that's my answer. Yeah.
It might also even be an issue of benchmark setting in the first place.
Look, I agree, and I think this is the whole. This is the great lacunae of research in community college language education. I wonder how, for example, let me just put this quick point to you. I wonder how common this situation is. I did a bunch of interviews just to make sure that this survey, which I had used for a bachelor's level study, was relevant for community colleges as well. So I checked with community college educators and asked, well, are all of these items relevant? And they all were. But what I found out was from one colleague of mine in the University of Hawaii system is that she does not have access to library subscriptions. They do not, and I don't know how widespread this is, but she fundamentally doesn't have an ability to do research on her own practices. Can't do action research, and so this is throughout Hawaii. Now I don't know how widespread this is, but This is what I think, this starts to explain why there's so little research coming from the community college language programs. You're involved in rather a nice project looking at outcomes, what seem to be sort of the expected or common learning benchmarks, targets that people reach in terms of the active proficiency guidelines, etc. Nothing like that. No analogous project like that in community colleges. We don't know what should be. It's a nice articulation project done by CARLA a number of years. I think it was a number of years ago. But something more more recent might be called for, I think. Yeah. Other question? Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned, in terms of student learning outcomes, actual proficiency.
Yeah.
In your research, either probably not so much the community college, but for your colleges, did you find student learning outcome measurements for outcomes that were more content oriented?
Yeah. I didn't get to that. Now, I do have a study on the Boyle that does ask about that. Looking at, I'm culling student learning outcome statements from wherever I can find them, and to look at precisely that type of thing. What do these outcomes look like? How are people conceptualizing them? I think it's a washback impact, right? I think you have this requirement now to come up with student outcomes of some type. What is the sort of wherewithal? What's the material? Where are people going to sort of write those statements? ACTFL provides a kind of ready, set kind of framework if you want to use it in all sorts of different ways. Depending on who you read or what type of whose ideas you subscribe to, maybe there might be a content type of approach to writing outcomes might be better suited, or trying to capture culture in ways that perhaps aren't so divorced from linguistic conceptualizations of language advancedness. I think it's an interesting issue given this kind of impulse, this requirement. What is the washback impact for university language educators when called upon to say, okay, what's advanced language ability at the end of the major? Right? Now, has this been, I'm curious to know, is there a large proportion of ACTFL use? Is it something else? I've had a quick look at the data for 4-year institutions, and it's rather a nice mix, actually. There's some anyhow. More to come on that at Triple-L, as it turns out. Yeah. Gotta go and do that study.
Well, thank you.